Let's record him.
Are we rolling?
Yes, so
Fantastic.
Whenever you're ready, Finley.
Whenever I'm ready. I better get started because we've not got too long, have we?
We've got plenty of time.
We've only got the hour. Right, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great satisfaction to be able to stand.
Sorry, so when we've done this in the past, people, there's always a point where people to ask questions. So as you're all in the second year now, you all should have a question this time. So make sure you are thinking of questions this time. Or contributions of some form. Okay, Finley.
Righto then, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great satisfaction to be able to stand before you for the first time since the commencement of the Michaelmas term, to be able to carry on that hallowed debating tradition that we've all, I hope, come to expect. It does sadden me there are no new contenders willing to take up the happy burden I've carried so frequently, but I live to serve, of course, and my service, it would seem, is most required in bandying a point to and fro with the equally recurring lady of the opposition. I'll curtail my preamble anon, as I was recently given to understand that my propensity for prolixity doesn't please anybody, save, of course, for our honourable princeps. It came as quite a surprise to me, indeed, that my previous speech's length of 18 minutes 55 seconds reduced some of you to tears of agonised boredom. It may interest you to know, ladies and gents, that at the trial of Warren Hastings, Edmund Burke delivered an opening statement that lasted for 4 days. Although if it really does bother you, all I can suggest is that someone else replace my own verbosity with their brevity and terseness, and if that doesn't convince you to do this job, I don't know what will. Now, on to the matter at hand. When first I was asked to offer my opinions of Sulla, I recollect as nearly as I can that I called him an opportunistic rabble-rouser, who would let nothing hinder him in his mission for power. And that remains my opinion, though I've refined it slightly since my initial outburst. I should like to be very clear about one point first, though. This detraction from Sulla is by no means a defence or a celebration of his opponents, nor indeed is it a defence of the status quo in the 1st century before Christ. It is a view in isolation of the character and doings of, to give him his full title and style, Marcus Cornelius Sulla, Imperator Felix. Allow me then to commence a narrative of the Sullan crimes as I have compiled them, which will serve as the main body of this speech, and which I shall punctuate with my judgments. I feel this to be the most efficient way of laying my case before you. Sulla's career began not as a political one, but a military one, and this is a field in which he clearly had some uncommon talent. I shall not assail his skill of soldiery, sufficiently proven by his consistent victories. However, his stubbornness of nature quickly showed in his inability to share credit with Marius for the successful conclusion of the Jugurthan War in 107 BC. Previous statements I've made to the class do somewhat bind my hands to accredit the thought as superior to the action that carried them out, but nevertheless, Marius was consul at this point in time and was thus due some credit for the victory that he brought about as commander, and Sulla's lack of respect for his station may indeed have prompted later indiscretions by Marius when Sulla himself assumed the consulship in 88. It's here that we see the first instance of a fateful flaw in Sulla's character, his ambition. The ambitious man was not provisioned for by the Roman constitution, petrified as it was by the potential for a return to monarchy. And so Sulla's ambition time and again led him to conflict with not just the Roman political system, but also with his potential friends, obliterating alliances that would have been useful, such as one with Marius, who was an undoubtedly powerful man at the time. The gens Cornelia was my apologies. His ambition was one of a number of threads that was weaved through his career and life like words through a stick of rock. Another of them is his debauched and depraved lifestyle. The gens Cornelia was an ancient name, but an equally undistinguished one, and in Sulla's time, the family found itself in an impoverished condition. Hence, the young Sulla grew up amongst the lower classes and acquired their lower tastes. It is this debauchery that cemented his rise to public life in the first place, with the death of one of his many heiresses affording him the sufficient funds to don the candid robes and assume public office. And indeed he did assume public office, ladies and gents, with his ascent to the consulship in 88, a year that he would personally ensure went down in infamy. Just as soon as he did, he took up a political cause that he maintained throughout his times in power, the oppression of the plebs. The tribune Sulpicius's reforms were quashed and a justicium called to halt business. This was an action so unpopular that it precipitated a riot which might easily have ended Sulla's career and spelled the end of his blot on history, had he not been sheltered in, of all people, Marius' home. From here, Sulla made no attempt to bring civil affairs closer to peace, but instead he ran away to the army, which was waiting to sail to the east to take up the campaign against Mithridates, the Pontian king. This was a command that Sulla had coveted and had raised hell when it was transferred from him by the Senate. And yet now, standing with his army at the shore, the army at his beck and call, does he choose to sail to the east and harry the Pontian king? No, indeed he does not, ladies and gentlemen. Envoys sent by Sulpicius were stoned to death, and Sulla marches back the way he came with 6 legions in order that he might commit that most execrable act of his whole 80 years among us, his crowning abomination. He marches on Rome. I'd like to draw special attention to the enormity of Sulla's march on Rome. The historic boundary of the city, the Pomerium, which had stood since the days of Romulus, had always been inviolable. Remus and his men were the first to find out the meaning of crossing the Pomerium armed, and it was upon this Pomerium that all subsequent Roman constitutional law was built. Sulla's disdain for tradition knew no bounds, not even the oldest and most sacred tradition in the book, the cornerstone of all Roman sovereignty and security. An act such as this is tantamount to treason, and in breaching the unbreachable, Sulla rid himself of any right he may have had to claim his work was in the interests of the Republic. By effort of street fighting, he managed to subdue the city in little time, and then, strong-arming the Senate with his military force, he had Marius, Sulpicius, and some other of his opponents declared outlaws, untried and unheard, despite them having done little to merit such harsh retribution. The latter of the two was lynched, and his head was placed upon a spike. There we see a third recurring theme of Sulla's career, a total disregard for tradition and the mos maiorum he would claim to defend. For a man whose conscience was so withered as to compel him to invade his own city, tribunician sacrosanctity was no bar at all to his bloodletting. Indeed, it would seem Sulla was adamant to have his own way, regardless of any traditional sense, and he had all of Sulpicius's laws disregarded as per vim, whilst also tampering with the legislative process to thwart any future tribunes who might have the gall to do the duty their office was created for. And then, after all that, Sulla decided that actually he really ought to be getting along to Pontus, come to think of it, and so he made arrangements to leave the city. But these arrangements proved to be thoroughly lacklustre. His co-consul, Pompeius Rufus, whom he left the army, was very, very soon murdered, and Cinna pretty quickly took up to meddling with the constitutional reforms that he was supposed to defend. It was thus that Sulla left Rome, blinded by his ambition to finally command in his own right. For it cannot be out of any sense of duty to Rome that he flew so quickly. If his sincere goal was to reform Roman politics, then why would he not rejoice in Marius taking the Mithridatic command from him, that he might remain in Rome and pursue his reforms safely? Why indeed would he not remain in Rome after having marched upon it, and see that his reforms were carried through? No, ladies and gents. These are the actions of an absent-minded and glory-hungry man, not the actions of a calculated public servant. Alas, he went to Pontus and began to harry Mithridates, and Rome did inevitably fall to the combined popularis forces under Marius and Cinna, and thus Sulla had left Rome open to the ruthless revenge that Marius proceeded to exact. Nevertheless, after the latter's death, the Senate did seem willing to at least be civil to Sulla. They sent reinforcements in 86 under Flaccus to attack Mithridates, though Sulla did of course later try and muddy the waters by claiming that these had been sent against him. And then he has the brass neck, a year later, to complain of his treatment and pontificate to the Senate of his past services. The Senate were willing to be pragmatic and offered an amnesty to a man thoroughly undeserving of one, but in 83 Sulla proclaimed that he would not be reconciled with his enemies, nor would he disband his loyal troops, but he would see to his own safety. These are the words of a separatist warlord, ladies and gentlemen. The campaign against Mithridates is as fine a litany of errors, misjudgments and blunders as one would care to recite. Just as soon as he had arrived in Greece, which Mithridates had largely subjugated, Sulla's men plundered the treasuries of Delphi and Olympia. Sulla was an educated man, he spoke Greek himself, and he should have known the significance of these sites, and prevented such an egregious crime against posterity. He did no such thing. Despite this inconsiderate approach to the land he feigned liberates, Sulla did have Mithridates a number of decisive defeats, and yet his aptness for martial affairs makes this next act all the more unpardonable. In 85, Sulla made peace with Mithridates. Mithridates, the man who had murdered his brother and imprisoned his own mother to cement his rise to power. Mithridates, the man who ruled monarchically against all Roman morals as an oriental despot after the model of Alexander the Great. Mithridates, the man who clearly harboured expansionist policies against Rome and had no respect for her borders. And, most appallingly of all, ladies and gentlemen, that most grievously dismissed wrong, Mithridates, the man who massacred 80,000 Roman civilians. All these inhumanities were brushed aside in a cruel half measure, executed by a man who wanted to be everywhere at once and claim credit for everything. Sulla, who had worked, connived, schemed, plotted so balefully to sneak the Mithridatic command, now abandoned it, half complete, in order to race back to the mess he had left in his wake in Rome, and in turn leave another behind him in Asia. He destroyed the Roman reinforcements, and his new commander Fimbria fell upon his sword. But Sulla did not run back to Italy without making quite certain that Anatolia and Greece would be in as great a mess as Rome was after his departure from it. He levied massive taxes upon states that sided with Mithridates and raised city walls. These nearsighted measures, aimed at completely the wrong people, meant that when Mithridates again invaded, as he was undoubtedly wont to do given his expansionist ideals, in the Second Mithridatic War of 83, these states were totally undefended, left in debt and despair by the man whose only concern was his own ambition and the glory required to fulfill it. It was then that Sulla returned to Italy and seized Rome once more after a bloody battle. He sent his protege Pompey to clear out remaining pockets of resistance in the colonies, and the brutality he exercised gained him the nickname of the Adolescentulus Carnifex, the butcher boy. Pompey would later be known to have a moderate nature, so it's unlikely he took these actions unprompted by Sulla's orders. And yet, even after Pompey carried out Sulla's purges of the populares, the latter begrudged having to share credit with the former, and delayed his triumph while caustically dubbing him Pompey Magnus, a sarcastic nickname that would only later gain official recognition. Now, with total control of Rome, Sulla began what became known as the Sullanum Regnum, a name that tips us off to his monarchical aspirations. His bloodlust was immoderate, so immoderate that the number of executions outstretched the capabilities of the state, and the prescriptions had to be used for the first time to outsource the killing. This was a terrible idea, and likely caused the deaths of many innocents. 40 senators, 1,600 equites, and if Errosius is to be believed, 9,000 total human souls were snuffed out. Rome wept that Sulla might triumph, wept tears of blood searing from eyes made red by cruel and enormous oppression, rolling down bruised cheeks and running in rivers of gore through the paving stones of the city, the same city that Sulla posed to be defender of. You may think that last utterance to be an exaggeration, mere oratorical flair on my behalf, but I invite you to do a little imagining. I ask you to cast your minds back to the recent assassination of Charles Kirk in America and the outcry and uproar that resulted from it. That, ladies and gents, was one death. Then I invite you to imagine if that same fate befell the membership of the House of Commons overnight. That, ladies and gentlemen, would be 650 deaths. I then invite you further still to imagine if each of the members of this college was snuffed out in a similar violent manner. That, ladies and gentlemen, would be 7,000 deaths. We're still not there, are we? I ask you to do this because it's so easy to regard deaths as a mere statistic when they happened millennia ago, but man has not changed in that time, and a death is a death is a death. Are we seriously to believe that just because 9,000 is a small number when compared with the other massacres of the past, that those people did not feel the same pain as others when they were snuffed out violently? It's ludicrous. But execution itself was not even good enough for those unlucky enough to fall on the wrong side of Sulla's indiscriminate blade. Those equites who met a sticky end found their properties confiscated, their descendants barred from the Senate forever, and their slaves reallocated to Sulla's personal bodyguard, a 10,000-man-strong ego trip named the Cornelii. But it's also likely indicative of a need for protection brought on by Sulla's own immoral excess and wanton destruction. It didn't stop there, of course. He also confiscated land in order that he might demobilise 120,000 men, many of whom did not turn out to be well suited to rural life and proved poor farmers. In this way, he made inadequate provisions for his own men, offering them lives that they were incapable of leading. He rigs the court system to allow patricians total domination of juries. He abolishes the corn distributions to the people. He allows the elections of 81 to proceed, granted, but not before he has the opposition candidate for the consulship murdered. Elections for show, ladies and gentlemen. Moreover, the Senate, after mass purges carried out under his orders, had dwindled in membership to 150, an all-time low, and Sulla made measures to reinflate its numbers, filling the senatorial benches with 300 equites in an act of cronyism that ensured all of his measures would be passed unthinkingly. It's possible these measures are striking a chord of familiarity in many of your minds, and this is in no small part due to the fact that, quite apart from acting disastrously in his own day, Sulla set dangerous precedents through his rule, which would invite the ambitious men of latter days to follow in his footsteps, and would offer them a framework for disrupting the Republic. And, of course, the roster of lunatic laws Sulla passed would not be complete without one last dig at the plebs, as his reforms to the office of tribune meant that it was defanged to such a degree as to almost make it superfluous. And what does Sulla get for all this chaos he has wrought? What is his punishment for an overthrow of the status quo? Why, an equestrian statue, of course, declaring he was performing the will of the gods. Sulla Felix, Sulla the divinely approved, ladies and gentlemen, Sulla's divine right. It appears to me that Sulla was only a diadem away from declaring himself the 8th king of Rome. However, all things must pass, and Sulla made a move almost as unprecedented in history as his march on Rome. he resigned. He stepped down from his dictatorship and retired to his country estate, a move that has baffled historians and prompted many theories, none of which flatter the man. The first is that put forth by Appian, that he was weary of war, weary of power, weary of Rome. And despite this image that he may lead you to conjure up of a man whose responsibilities outstretched his capabilities, an aging man carrying these responsibilities, remember that he took these responsibilities at the point of a gladius, and his weariness may have been caused by him carrying them whilst wading waist high in blood. Then there is the argument Julius Caesar put forth, that Sulla did not know his political ABCs. If this be the case, and Sulla retired because he assumed he'd fixed everything that needed fixing, it demonstrates, as Caesar said, a fundamental misunderstanding of the Roman constitution. Was he so naive as to believe that nobody would meddle with his reforms? If so, Sulla was exceptionally short-sighted. Merely years before, Cinna had meddled with his laws. Are we to assume that he did not learn from this? Then there is the possibility that Sulla was embittered by the resistance of others to his changes and resigned in revenge, hoping the whole thing would fall down as payback. His conversation with Caesar certainly supports this idea, and his sparing of Caesar's life evidences the notion that Sulla wished mischief on Rome. And finally, and least flatteringly of all, was Carcopino's verdict, that Sulla's resignation was a result of his inability to become king. The misdeed in that is hardly necessary to point out, I'm sure you'll agree. So, after all that, what is my verdict upon Sulla? What conclusion may we draw of him? A conservative, but not a traditionalist. An opportunist, but not a forward thinker. An officer, but not a gentleman. He is a man of manifold contradictions of character and equally capricious of action. His ambition led him to massive achievements, but his obsession led him to turn his hand to everything. As jack of all trades, he mastered none. The one military campaign he orchestrated was disastrous. His political career was shameful, and the life he retired to after shrugging his shoulders and walking away from politics was one of such egregious excess that he drank himself to an early grave. He was overconfident of his powers and so supported his constitutional reforms alone, but when the solitary pillar cracked and fell away, the whole system he had overseen crumbled to ruin atop it. He showed a disregard for tradition, a disdain for Rome, and a willingness to turn to violence to solve any problem. And of course, a problem in this context, ladies and gentlemen, simply means any opposition to his own iron will. But perhaps the worst crime of all lay in the precedent he set. His actions were odious in isolation, but they degenerated the character of Roman politics and accelerated the beginnings of a perfidious imperial system not 60 years on. I give you Marcus Cornelius Sulla, ladies and gentlemen, a cad, a rotter, and a bad example. Thank you.